turn to Matthew chapter 16. We're going to look at verses 21 to 23 this morning in our continuation of Matthew's gospel. And I've entitled this message, Beginning the Steep Ascent. This is sort of marks a transition in Jesus' focus and his emphasis in his ministry here, as you'll see in just a moment here. You know, the path that Jesus traversed from the time of his temptation in the wilderness, Matthew 4, to Peter's confession of Christ in Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16. That path had been relatively smooth. Besides the harsh criticism of the scribes and Pharisees and the cool reception of his hometown of Nazareth, Jesus had been received pretty well by those who encountered him and saw him in action. His popularity among the Galileans had grown steadily. Many people had concluded that he was, at the very least, a genuine prophet sent by God. However, Jesus lived during a time when the Jews were anticipating not just a prophet, but the deliverer who would restore their favored status in the world and install God's visible kingdom on the earth. They called this person Messiah or Christ. And the reason they were looking for him is because their scriptures contain dozens of prophecies that predicted his coming and the kingdom he would establish. From chapters 4 to 16, Matthew has carefully authenticated Jesus' identity as that anticipated Messiah. Jesus proved that he was the Christ by his authoritative teaching and by his astounding miracles, which included healing the sick, making the lame to walk and the blind to see, exorcising demons, walking on water, multiplying a few loaves and fish to feed thousands, and even raising a dead girl to life. But even though Jesus did these things, many of which were direct fulfillments of those Old Testament prophecies, many people remained ambivalent about his identity. The religious leaders, for example, and for a variety of reasons, accused him of being from the devil. Some thought he was the second coming of Elijah. Others that he was a reincarnated John the Baptist. Still others, one of the other prophets like Jeremiah. But when Jesus asked the disciples who they thought he was, Peter exclaimed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Pastor Brad did an excellent job of explaining these verses last week, and I would encourage you to read or listen to that message if you have not already. Suffice it to say, Jesus' words were a tremendous source of encouragement for Peter. Jesus had declared him to be blessed and then promised that he would have a prominent role in his future kingdom. It is not difficult to imagine what was going on in Peter's mind after this conversation. I'm guessing that he was downright giddy. Wow, this is so cool. This is turning out even better than I thought. I mean, I knew that being one of the 12 was an honor. But it sounds like I'm going to be having a key role in the days ahead. I wonder what that's going to look like. Will I be Jesus' chief of staff or his top advisor? Will my office be right next to the Oval Office in the State House? And when will this all come about? Is Jesus going to make his move soon and start appointing cabinet members and assembling his army? And how is Jesus going to overcome his political adversaries who are currently in positions of power, the Pharisees and Sadducees? Will Jesus be able to change their minds about him and secure their support, their allegiance? I'm pretty sure that Peter's imagination was very active after Jesus singled him out and said he would have an important role in the kingdom. I'm pretty sure he was expecting Jesus to shed more light on the specific developments of his impending administration. So it's no surprise that what came next was a shock to Peter's theological sensibilities. Look at verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Think about that statement from Peter and the disciples' perspective. Jesus had just confirmed that he was indeed the Christ, the Messiah. Messiah was the deliverer who would liberate the Jews from their oppressors. Messiah was the son of David, a warrior prince who would reign on David's throne in Jerusalem in unrivaled splendor and majesty. And yet, after confirming that he was the Messiah, Jesus began to show his disciples that instead of going to Jerusalem to be crowned the king, he would go there and suffer at the hands of religious authorities and be killed. That did not make a bit of sense. It did not fit into their theological notions about Messiah and the kingdom. It did not resonate with their expectations of their own roles as Messiah's confidants and cabinet members. I mean, seriously, what good can a dead Messiah do? How can he possibly lead a revolution and overthrow an empire like Rome? He may be a source of inspiration, but you cannot count on a dead man to be your king. I want to remind you that we've entitled this whole series in Matthew, The Upside Down Kingdom. And certainly, what Jesus just said to his disciples was upside down from their perspective. He was telling them yet again that their expectations and preconceived notions about what Messiah would do and how his kingdom would be inaugurated did not correspond with God's will. They were under the impression that in the days ahead, Jesus would continue to get more popular and more powerful until he had won over the whole nation of Israel. Jesus just told them that his popularity was going to take a nosedive, that his public approval rating would tank, and that people would become so angry and offended by him that he would be assaulted and killed. But Jesus wants them to know that this is God's plan. Notice, Matthew says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples. There were a couple of other times previously that Jesus had hinted at his suffering and death. But this is a dramatic and intentional shift in Jesus' focus. From this point on, Jesus is giving his disciples new information and new insight about God's plans and purposes regarding his life and ministry. Theologians have a term for this. It's called progressive revelation. And this is a pattern for the way God has revealed himself and his will to his people. It simply means that he reveals himself and his will incrementally, little by little. When reading the Old Testament, one discovers that he revealed only so much of himself and his will at any one time. And so, for example, he revealed really quite little to Abraham. Then he revealed quite a bit more to Moses, and then some more to David, and more to Isaiah, and more to Ezekiel. That continued on when Jesus was living. And such was the case here with Jesus and his disciples. Jesus had spent time with them, authenticating himself by his words and deeds as the Messiah. And as we learned last week, the Father revealed to them, to Peter, and I'm sure to the other disciples, that he was indeed the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That's very important revelation. But it's not everything. Now Jesus begins to show them that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised. Listen, this is new information, but it's not much information at this point. It's just a bare bones summary of what lies ahead. Jesus didn't tell them specifically about the cross or about the significance of his shed blood. Jesus does not tell them at this point that there were far more powerful enemies than Rome from which they needed to be delivered, namely sin, Satan, and death, and that God had sent his Messiah into this world to defeat those enemies through his death and resurrection. In fact, Peter and the other disciples were not going to know much about that at all until after Jesus died and rose again. But even with the minimal amount of information that Jesus gave here, it was still unsettling. It was still shocking. And Peter has a dramatic reaction in verse 22. Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." In typical fashion, it is Peter who opens his mouth first, perhaps emboldened by what Jesus had just said to him regarding his future role in the kingdom. He actually takes the Lord aside and rebukes him. And he does so, according to the grammar in the Greek, in a very emphatic way. No way, Lord. This will never happen. It's hard to know exactly what motivated Peter to be so emphatic. Some have suggested that he was overconfident after his commendation by Jesus and thought he knew better than Jesus what should happen to him. I rather think that it was just an impulsive reaction to information that he was not yet prepared to accept, information that rocked his world. Peter could not yet conceive of a suffering Messiah, let alone a dead Messiah. For Peter, it was unthinkable that the Messiah could or would be rejected by the Jewish nation and humiliated in the way that Jesus described. And I can imagine that his reaction came more from confusion, fear, perhaps even panic, than pride. Whatever the reasons, Jesus has an interesting response in verse 23. But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." You know, it's impossible not to see the irony in Jesus' statement to Peter. He had just finished calling him blessed. He had just assigned to him a prominent role in his kingdom. Now he's calling him Satan. What did he mean by that? Was he suggesting that Peter suddenly was demon-possessed? Or that Satan was literally speaking through him? I don't think so, although some have interpreted it that way. I believe Jesus is indicating that the perspective Peter represents here is the same as Satan's. What does Satan do? What did he try to do in the temptations in the wilderness? He tried to thwart God's plan for Jesus. He tried to get Jesus to circumvent God's plan for his life. It's interesting that the Greek word translated "get behind me" or "get away from me" is the same word Jesus used to rebuke Satan in the wilderness temptation. Trying to thwart God's plan for Jesus' life is the role of the devil, not the role of a disciple. And so Peter emphatically rejects Peter's suggestion and rebukes him for it. That steep ascent, which would take Jesus to Jerusalem where he would suffer at the hands of the religious authorities, would take him ultimately to Golgotha, where he would be killed and crucified on a cross, was God's method of providing salvation for the whole world. And Peter needed to embrace this. even if he did not fully understand it. It's kind of interesting. Jesus had just assigned him to be the foundation block for the church. Now he was calling Peter a stumbling block to God's plans. That's the meaning, the literal meaning of the word translated hindrance. It means stumbling block. And Matthew frequently uses the word as a metaphor for an enticement to sin. Peter's suggestion that Jesus bypass that road to suffering, that he go straight to the throne without having to suffer or be killed, might seem like the suggestion of a caring friend. But it does not take into consideration God's primary purpose for sending his Son into this world. And that's why Jesus would say to him, you're not thinking according to God's perspective. You're thinking man's thoughts. Peter had a human perspective at this point. You know what a human perspective is. Humans are naturally drawn to comfort, safety, security. Humans naturally take the path of least resistance. Humans naturally avoid steep, perilous paths that lead to pain and suffering and death. But such is the path that God had determined Jesus take. Because God planned to do something through Jesus' suffering and death that was absolutely necessary for Peter's well-being, for the disciples' well-being, for the Jewish nation's well-being, and for the world's well-being. And I want to just submit to you this plan, even though Peter didn't understand it, probably the other disciples didn't either, this plan was nothing new. God had predicted that it would be through this perilous path of suffering that Messiah would do his primary work in the world. I'm going to just spend some time reading to you. You'll see it on the screen. Isaiah 53. I want you to realize this was prophesied 700 years before Christ came into the world. But listen to these words, because this is what Jesus was referring to about the path ahead. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned, every one of us, to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of Yahweh, the Lord, to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Wow. This was God's will. This was God's plan in order to fulfill God's purposes. It did not make a bit of sense to Peter at the time. It still does not make sense to people today who merely think from a human perspective. You've heard what the Apostle Paul said. He said the message of the cross is what? It's foolishness to those who are perishing. It is nonsensical. It's offensive. It's a symbol of revulsion and shame. I'll never forget reading what Oxford philosopher Sir Alfred Eyre wrote about the cross. He said, of all religions, Christianity is the most barbaric because it rests on the cross, making it, quote, intellectually contemptible and morally outrageous, end of quote. And while that may seem to us like a great overstatement, it is simply the rational, logical, honest conclusion who does not comprehend the horrific nature of sin and its dreadful consequences. And someone who doesn't understand what is required to satisfy the justice of a holy, righteous God so that a sinner can be pardoned of that sin and be reconciled to him. Later in the New Testament, we are told that Jesus' death on the cross was a sin offering, a blood sacrifice that was necessary in order to appease the wrath of God against the sin of humanity. He died in the place of sinners so there could be forgiveness and reconciliation between God and sinners. And if he did not do this, every human being would go to hell, which is where every human being deserves to go when they die. You can see why this teaching becomes intellectually contemptible when someone doesn't believe in God or in life after death. You can see where it becomes morally outrageous when this supposed God is believed to be perfect and must be placated. It becomes barbaric when this method of appeasement is a blood sacrifice. Blood? Why, that's foolishness. So why do we Christians in the 21st century still cling to the old rugged cross? Simply because, as Paul continued in that verse, while the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The cross, brutal, bloody, and horrible as it was God's method of rescuing us from our lost and sinful condition. It was the means by which our sins could be paid for, and God's justice could be satisfied, and peace with God could be secured. A peace that blossoms in this life when we are reconciled to Him by faith in Jesus, but a peace that comes to full flower when we get to live in His presence forever and ever. That's why Jesus had to begin that steep ascent and go to a cross and die in our place and then be raised from the dead so that He could defeat our ultimate enemies, sin, Satan, and death.